I was very struck by the dinner you mentioned at your last International Leaders Summit, by the remarks of Maurice McTeague, who made this argument that we, free marketeers, have won the battle of ideas, but lost the battle of implementation. Think of how the intellectual debate has shifted since the early days when Hayek and Friedman and Anthony Fisher and the earliest Homeric patriarchs of our movement were raising their lonely voices against the consensus. Almost nobody now argues for the inevitability of socialism, for the desirability of state planning. Almost nobody makes a case from first principles as to why the state should control major public services. And yet, the percentage of wealth taken by governments continues to grow. The amount of regulation is heaped higher and higher with every passing year. The vested interests of the standing apparat absorb the intellectual victories that have been won by free marketeers in the intervening decades. And I'd like to begin by thanking Natasha and Joel for trying to bridge that gap between the battle of ideas and the battle of implementation. There's been the most extraordinary intellectual victory since the height of the fashionability of planning in the 1940s by the conservative movement. And you are providing a bridge between that victory and public policy. And meetings like this are an enormously important part of that process. And it's wonderful to see here so many of my favourite think tanks, Atlas and Open Europe and Heritage, as well as the Adriatic Institute. You are the sacerdotal figures who feed the sacred flame of liberty in our movement, and those of us who come occasionally to do obeisance before it are grateful for the permanent standing priesthood. Let's address directly the issue on the agenda of promoting reform in Europe. And let me ask you to do it by joining me in a little thought experiment. Imagine that you were a visitor from the planet Mars around about 500 years ago, circling the globe in your flying saucer, looking down at the civilizations of the Earth. I put it to you that you would have not put much money on the rise of Europe as the dominant force of the next half millennium. You'd have looked down through your little porthole and you'd have seen these great, powerful, impressive Oriental civilizations, the Mings and the Mughals and the Ottomans. You'd have seen the enormous advances that they'd made in cartography, in mathematics, in architecture, in astrology. You'd have seen their canals, their ships, their paper money, their gunpowder. You would have then noticed these broken, scattered tribes at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass, and you would have written them off. You'd have assumed that it was going to be China that sailed round the Cape of Africa and discovered Portugal, rather than the other way around. Now, why didn't that happen? What was it about this part of the world that generated the entrepreneurial force that went on to dominate the next 500 years? Well, here I'm not going to say anything very original. I'm going to borrow an argument first advanced by the Australian historian E.L. Jones in the 1980s, although taken to a much wider audience by Paul Kennedy in the 1990s in his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. The special thing about Europe was precisely that it never became centralized. It never became a single state. It remained rather a diverse plurality of competing states. Whereas the Oriental empires went down this road towards more regulation and higher taxes and government by a class of mandarins or bureaucrats, Europe was always a diversity of different polities, competing one with another, able to copy best practice, to innovate, to pilot new ideas. Sometimes in the most literal way, as when Peter the Great sent out his agents to copy what was best about English shipbuilding or Dutch cannons or whatever it was. We fostered a peculiar spirit of enterprise and adventurism. So although there was not, in relative terms, a great civilization, great resources, although there was not anything like the administrative unity and the impressiveness of the Eastern empires, there was something much more valuable than that. There was competitiveness based on the spirit of individual freedom. Now, you can see where this is going. Right? The tragedy of Europe in our age is that just as the Eastern civilizations have discovered the secret that made us wealthy and prosperous and free, we are going in the opposite direction. Just as the Asian powers are learning the benefits of decentralization and devolution and competition, we are adopting our own version of the Ming, Mughal, Ottoman path towards ever closer union, harmonization, more bureaucracy, more rules, higher taxes. You don't find mandarins in China now, but you do find mandarins in Brussels. The mandarinate was peculiar in that, although as to work in the European Commission there was a pretty tough exam to get in, it was a system that elevated what we would now call political correctness, holding the right ideas over any spirit of enterprise or originality. I visited China for the first time last year, and the one Mandarin I met was the EU ambassador there. He didn't have a long ponytail, he didn't have those jeweled nail guards, but his attitudes were those of the traditional unelected governor. And I said to him, because I didn't want to be getting this wrong, I said, my understanding, you've been here for 5 years, my understanding is that China now is investing a lot of time in provincial autonomy and decentralization and devolution and so on. And he said, yes, holding up his jeweled fingers. Oh, well, they weren't jeweled. That was in my imagination. But they ought to have been, right, in horror. He said, yes, it's unbelievable. He said, imagine a country of this size making these terrible mistakes. It's as though we were trying to govern the European Union with no European Commission, no European Parliament, and no European Court of Justice. And I said, well, 12% a year growth. They seem to be managing somehow, And it was the most wonderful, telling example of what is going wrong in the 21st century. He then went on to say that, there was a problem that pensions weren't portable between different Chinese provinces and there were different systems of social security and so on. But the figures speak for themselves. The European Union, depending on how you measure it, now accounts for something like 26% of world GDP. In another 15 years, on current projections, that will be 15% of GDP. We are in a massive regional decline. And the reason for that is that we have forgotten the basis of our own continent's success, our contribution to the happiness of humanity, namely the precepts of personal freedom, pluralism, variety, and diversity. Now, here's a hard thing that needs saying. That mistake, this absence of competitiveness, is intrinsic in the model of political integration. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, yes, I'm all for a strong and powerful European Union, but of course the European Union must be more competitive. Right? This is, let's call it the Lisbon agenda fallacy, the idea that you can get the political union but still have the economic competitiveness. We have tested that proposition, my friends. We have empirical evidence that it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for reasons that are, I'm afraid, unmissable, inexorable. Right? And the reasons are this. Competitiveness will always encourage more prosperity, more freedom, more innovation, whereas centralization is an alternative to competitiveness. In a system of competing jurisdictions, you can raise your taxes up to a certain level before the money starts going abroad because it no longer suits people to remain within your jurisdiction. But within a system where there is tax harmonization, there is an alternative to the painful process of cutting spending and reducing the fiscal burden on people. You can simply export your costs to everyone else within the bloc, which, of course, is what is happening now in the European Union.